Welcome to this session on the evolution of the Indian Constitution. Today, we will explore how India's constitutional framework developed over time. We will trace its roots from ancient Indian governance, through colonial rule and the independence movement, to the final drafting of the Constitution. We will discuss key events, British influence, and the role of reforms that shaped India's governance. By the end of this session, you will understand how historical events paved the way for India's constitution. Let's begin. India's constitution has a long history, shaped by ancient rulers, colonial laws, and the nationalist movement. In ancient India, empires like the Maurya, Gupta, and Mughal dynasties had organized administration systems. However, during colonial rule, the British introduced governance primarily for their own control. Laws like the Regulating Act of 1773 and Pitt's India Act of 1784 centralized British power in India. These laws focused on administration but did not grant Indians any political rights. As British rule expanded, governance laws evolved. The Charter Acts of 1833 and 1853 introduced a more structured administration. After the revolt of 1857, the Government of India Act 1858 transferred power directly to the British Crown. Later, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919 introduced limited self-governance through Dyarchy, where Indians controlled some provincial matters. However, real power remained with the British. The Government of India Act 1935 laid the foundation for federal governance, and the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946 eventually led to the Constituent Assembly. British rule created dissatisfaction and increased the demand for a constitution. The revolt of 1857 was a major turning point, showing widespread resentment against British policies. In response, the Government of India Act 1858 placed India under direct British rule. Over time, organizations like the Indian National Congress, 1885, demanded civil rights and political reforms. The Indian Councils Acts of 1892 and 1909 introduced minor changes, but Indians still lacked true self-governance. As demands for freedom grew, the British introduced harsh laws like the Rowlatt Act of 1919, which allowed imprisonment without trial. This led to mass protests and the non-cooperation movement in 1920, followed by the civil disobedience movement in 1930. The Government of India Act 1935 brought major reforms, introducing a federal system, but real power remained with the British. Finally, the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946 set the stage for the drafting of India's constitution. Several key events contributed to the formation of the Constitution. Early laws like the Regulating Act of 1773 and Pitt's India Act of 1784 gave the British more control over Indian administration. The Charter Acts of 1833 and 1853 expanded their governance structure. After the revolt of 1857, the Government of India Act 1858 officially placed India under the British Crown. Over time, the Indian Councils Acts of 1861, 1892, and 1909 introduced some Indian representation in governance, but real power remained with the British. In 1919, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms introduced a dual system of governance known as Dyarchy. However, British dominance continued, leading to widespread protests. The Simon Commission of 1927, which had no Indian members, was met with strong opposition. In response, the Nehru Report of 1928 was India's first attempt to draft a constitution. Later, the Government of India Act 1935 introduced a federal system, but India still lacked full independence. The Quit India movement of 1942 demanded complete self-rule. And finally, the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946 allowed the formation of the Constituent Assembly, which drafted the Indian Constitution. The British government played a major role in shaping India's constitutional development, though often in a way that maintained British control. British governance in India was highly centralized, ensuring their authority remained intact. The Regulating Act of 1773 was the first law that introduced British control mechanisms in India. Later, the Indian Councils Act of 1861 allowed Indians to be part of advisory councils, but they had no real power in governance. The Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 introduced separate electorates for Muslims, further dividing Indian society along religious lines. As the demand for self-governance grew, Britain introduced more constitutional changes. The Government of India Act 1919 brought in Dyarchy, where Indians were allowed to control certain provincial matters, but major powers remained with the British. The Government of India Act 1935 was a significant step, as it proposed a federal structure for India, although it was never fully implemented. Later, under increasing pressure, the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946 allowed Indians to draft their own constitution. Finally, the Indian Independence Act of 1947 marked the end of British rule and transferred power to Indian leaders, paving the way for complete sovereignty. India's independence movement played a crucial role in shaping constitutional thinking. Early demands for rights began with movements like the Swaraj movement of 1905 and the Nehru Report of 1928, which advocated for self-rule and fundamental rights. Mahatma Gandhi's ideals of non-violence, self-rule and social equality deeply influenced the Constitution's emphasis on justice and democracy. The Indian National Congress (INC) continuously pushed for greater political representation, eventually leading to discussions on a democratic system for independent India. Several key events in the independence movement directly influenced constitutional discussions. The Rowlatt Act of 1919, which allowed imprisonment without trial, triggered widespread protests and reinforced the need for civil rights protections. The Quit India movement of 1942 was a turning point, strengthening demands for a written constitution that guaranteed independence and democracy. India's leaders also drew inspiration from the American and French revolutions, incorporating principles like liberty, equality, and fundamental rights into the constitution. Finally, the formation of the Constituent Assembly in 1946 was the last step before drafting the constitution, reflecting the aspirations of an independent India. Before independence, various constitutional reforms were introduced to gradually include Indians in governance. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 marked the first attempt at involving Indians in legislative councils, though their role was only advisory. The Indian Councils Act of 1892 allowed for limited discussions in legislative councils, but real power remained with the British. Later, the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 introduced separate electorates, a move that divided Indian communities and limited national unity. The British continued making reforms, but most were designed to maintain their authority. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919 introduced Dyarchy, allowing Indians to govern certain aspects of provincial administration, while the British retained control over key areas like finance and law. The Government of India Act 1935 was the most significant pre-independence reform, introducing federalism and provincial autonomy, though it still kept India under British rule. Finally, the Indian Independence Act of 1947 granted India full sovereignty, ending colonial rule and allowing the country to govern itself through a newly formed constitution. The Government of India Acts played a crucial role in shaping India's constitutional development. The Government of India Act 1858 was a turning point, as it ended the rule of the East India Company and placed India directly under the British Crown. This act introduced a centralized administrative system controlled by the British government. Later, the Government of India Act 1861 allowed limited Indian participation in governance by appointing a few Indians to legislative councils, though they had no real power. The Government of India Act 1892 expanded legislative discussions, allowing Indians to question policies, but still preventing them from having significant decision-making authority. As Indian demands for self-rule increased, Britain introduced more constitutional changes. The Government of India Act 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto reforms, introduced separate electorates for Muslims, further dividing Indian society. The Government of India Act 1935 was a landmark law that created provincial autonomy and introduced direct elections for the first time. Although it still kept India under British control, it served as a blueprint for India's future parliamentary democracy. Many governance structures introduced in these acts were later incorporated into the Indian Constitution. National leaders played a key role in shaping the Indian Constitution by advocating for democracy, equality, and justice. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, as the chairman of the drafting committee, was the principal architect of the Constitution. He focused on fundamental rights, social justice, and the abolition of untouchability. Jawaharlal Nehru played a critical role by introducing the Objectives Resolution, which outlined India's vision as a sovereign, democratic, and secular state. Mahatma Gandhi influenced the Constitution through his principles of self-rule, non-violence, and social justice, which later shaped policies on social equity and village self-governance. Other national leaders also contributed significantly to the making of the constitution. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel played a crucial role in integrating 562 princely states into the Indian Union, ensuring national unity. Dr. Rajendra Prasad, as the President of the Constituent Assembly, led debates and discussions, ensuring a balanced and inclusive constitution. Sarojini Naidu, a prominent freedom fighter, strongly advocated for women's rights and equal representation in governance. The collective efforts of these leaders ensured that the Indian constitution reflected the principles of democracy, justice, and equality for all citizens. The Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946 was a crucial step toward India's independence. It proposed the formation of a constituent assembly that would draft India's constitution, allowing Indians to shape their governance. The plan also suggested a federal structure, where provinces would have autonomy while remaining part of a united India. Additionally, it planned for an interim government led by Indian leaders, marking a transition from British rule to self-governance. The Cabinet Mission Plan led to the first meeting of the Constituent Assembly in December 1946, which began drafting the constitution. However, it failed to prevent the partition of India, as differences between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League led to the creation of Pakistan. Despite this, the plan played a vital role in ensuring that India adopted a democratic constitution, laying the foundation for self-rule and governance based on justice and equality. The demand for civil rights had a significant impact on constitutional discussions in India. Social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Jyotirao Phule fought against discrimination and advocated for equality. Their work influenced the inclusion of social justice principles in the constitution. Gandhian movements, which promoted non-violent resistance, further emphasized the need for legal protections for individual freedoms and rights. The demand for civil rights directly influenced the drafting of fundamental rights, Articles 14 to 32, in the Indian Constitution, ensuring protections for equality, freedom, and justice. The Constituent Assembly debates reflected these concerns, leading to a strong legal framework that upholds democracy and safeguards individual rights. These discussions shaped India's constitution as a document that guarantees justice, liberty, and dignity for all citizens. Let's begin with a question. What was a key feature of the Government of India Act 1935? Your options are A. Complete self-governance for Indians. B. Introduction of a federal structure. C. Abolition of the British rule in India. D. Establishment of the Constituent Assembly. Take a moment and think. The correct answer is B. Introduction of a federal structure. Checkmark. This act introduced provincial autonomy and direct elections, forming the basis for India's federal system. Now let's test your understanding. Why was the Quit India Movement 1942 significant? A. It demanded complete independence. B. It introduced the first Indian constitution. C. It led to the first national elections. D. It resulted in the abolition of the caste system. Take your best guess. The correct answer is A. It demanded complete independence. Checkmark. The Quit India Movement, launched by Mahatma Gandhi, called for an end to British rule immediately, leading to strong nationalist sentiments. Here's your next question. Which act introduced Dyarchy in Indian provinces? A. Regulating Act 1773. B. Indian Councils Act 1892. C. Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms 1919. D. Government of India Act 1858. Think carefully before answering. The correct answer is C. Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms 1919. Checkmark. This reform introduced Dyarchy, a system where power was divided between elected Indian ministers and British officials. Time for another question. What was the role of the Simon Commission? A. To introduce adult suffrage in India. B. To propose federalism in the constitution. C. To suggest reforms in India's governance. D. To establish separate electorates. Take a guess. The correct answer is C. To suggest reforms in India's governance. Checkmark. The Simon Commission, 1927, was formed to review India's constitutional progress, but it was boycotted because it had no Indian members. Let's move on. What was the objective of the Nehru Report, 1928? A. To demand complete independence. B. To propose a draft Indian constitution. C. To introduce separate electorates. D. To implement religious laws. Think and choose your answer. The correct answer is B. To propose a draft Indian constitution. The Nehru Report was India's first attempt at drafting a constitution based on self-rule and fundamental rights. Here comes another one. Why was the Indian National Congress formed in 1885? A. To demand British rule in India. B. To advocate for Indian rights and representation. C. To establish trade agreements with Britain. D. To introduce the first Indian legal system. Make your choice. The correct answer is B. To advocate for Indian rights and representation. The Indian National Congress (INC) was formed to promote political discussions and demand greater representation for Indians. Next question. What was a major impact of the Cabinet Mission Plan, 1946? A. It led to India's first elections. B. It introduced fundamental rights. C. It paved the way for the Constituent Assembly. D. It abolished British control immediately. Choose wisely. The correct answer is C. It paved the way for the Constituent Assembly. The Cabinet Mission Plan allowed Indians to draft their own constitution, shaping the future of India. Here's another one. Which British Act transferred power from the East India Company to the British Crown? A. Government of India Act, 1858. B. Charter Act, 1833. C. Regulating Act, 1773. D. Government of India Act, 1935. Take a moment to think. The correct answer is A. Government of India Act, 1858. This act marked the end of East India Company rule and placed India directly under British Crown administration. Let's test your knowledge again. Which movement intensified the demand for fundamental rights in India? A. Civil Disobedience Movement. B. Indian Councils Act Movement. C. Cabinet Mission Plan. D. First Round Table Conference. Think before answering. The correct answer is A. Civil Disobedience Movement. This movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi, focused on freedom, self-rule and individual rights. Now, for the final question. Which constitutional principle was inspired by the Irish Constitution? A. Fundamental rights. B. Directive principles of state policy. C. Federal structure. D. Separate electorates. Give it your best shot. The correct answer is B. Directive principles of state policy. Inspired by Ireland, the directive principles were included to guide the government in social and economic welfare policies. That wraps up our MCQ session. Hope you got most of them right. Keep practicing and see you in the next lesson. Thank you for watching this lecture on the evolution of the Indian Constitution. We hope this session helped you understand the historical foundations of India's Constitution. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel for more informative content. Stay tuned for the next lecture in this series. See you in the next session.